For some of us, things just got a little more expensive today, with the ANZ Bank putting up interest rates. The cost of living is shaping up as a major issue, and now 2 independent MPs are targeting the state government over sewerage charges, with a plan to embarrass them into change. Nick Xenophon and John Darley say the current system misleads consumers, as it is, in reality, a property tax. And 20 years after the Productivity Commission recommended getting rid of it, only this state and Western Australia persist in using the system. The government, though, insists it is a sewerage charge and not a property tax. And it's also the fairest way of charging for a messy business.
You got me begging you for mercy. Why won't you release me?
If the sheer size and flurry of bills has not convinced you, perhaps the commentary will. The cost of living is hurting.
It is getting worse. People are really tightening their belts and they're feeling it with greater acuity in terms of their cost of living pressures.
There are priorities, and one of the priorities is looking after those who are suffering most in our community. It is actually core business of government.
More and more utility prices are contributing to the pain. Around Australia, gas, water and electricity have scooted well above the annual inflation rate of around 3%. And while electricity charges have had more publicity, in South Australia it's the surge in water bills that's been the bigger shock.
In Adelaide, water and sewerage charges have actually risen at an average annual rate of 16.8%. That is almost 17% per annum over the last 5 years, and that's way ahead of the overall inflation figure.
By comparison, he says electricity has risen by just over 10%. The state government made a deliberate decision to hike water prices, to make people value water more and to pay for the desal plant. But while the price of water has risen, according to MPs John Darley and Nick Xenophon, for many people, the actual water component remains a minor part of an increasingly large bill.
I know with one of mine that I quoted recently, the actual total bill was $300. The sewage charge was $200. The supply charge was $58, and the balance was water.
It's that sewerage charge that has angered both MPs. On its bills to households, SA Water says the sewerage charge is
the quarterly charge for the removal and treatment of wastewater based on your property's value.
It's actually quite misleading, and in terms of transparency, it's as clear as untreated sewage, because what it's doing is effectively implying that there's a link between property values and the service provided, and there isn't, and that's something that needs to be fixed up.
Oh, well, it's a property tax. The idea that sewerage charges should be in some way related to the value of a property, irrespective of the income of the property owners, let alone the extent to which they make use of sewerage facilities, does look a bit anachronistic these days.
The Productivity Commission says it's been anachronistic for years. In its 1993 report, the Productivity Commission said,
property values have no necessary relationship to the costs of providing services such as water and sewerage, and the practice of using them as a basis for charging should end.
The reason that this state government persists with this system is they're a cash-strapped government, and they have at their fingertips a cash cow.
Last year's budget papers show the state government expects to reap a $246 million dividend from SA Water. Saul Estlake argues there's no incentive to improve the wastewater system either, because the money just rolls in regardless of whether the service is good, bad or indifferent. According to Anglicare CEO Lynn Arnold, the steep rises are water torture for many low-income earners.
Government is about helping all of us in community live as effectively together as possible. And if some people end up being further marginalised by cost problems, then government has an obligation to look at that, especially when they may be the author of the cost problems.
Now, after having fought for years to get both Liberal and Labor governments to stop using property values, John Darley is going to try and embarrass them into change.
We're considering legislative amendment that requires SA Water to include on the bill not only the valuation but also the actual cost of the treatment of the waste.
And once you empower consumers with that information, then I think you'll get a groundswell of political support for some real changes to the way properties are charged in terms of sewage treatment.
But change to what? One argument put forward in favour of property-based taxes is that they hit those who can afford to pay and cushion those who can't.
If taking away the current model were to mean that those who could afford to pay more don't pay more, which will then mean that those who can't afford to pay more will pay more, the government would have to think very carefully about that.
But others insist these days there are plenty of everyday homeowners sitting on fixed incomes struggling to pay for their rising assets. John Darley believes quarterly water bills which show summer and winter water consumption make it straightforward to work out how much water goes into the household and therefore out again as waste, and how much goes into the garden.
Be honest with people about how you're charging them. Don't try and have a cloak of saying this is a valuation charge when in fact the actual cost of providing the service is much less.
And SA Water didn't respond to our request for an interview. Water Minister, though, Paul Kiker, has agreed to speak to us next week and in the meantime issued this statement.
The sewerage charge is not a property tax. The use of property-based charging for sewerage services is currently considered the most practical, equitable and cost-effective way of sharing the cost of providing the service. Any changes to this may lead to an increased burden being placed on those with the least capacity to pay. The government also says when the Essential Services Commission takes over setting water and sewerage charges, they will be asked to review the way water and sewerage charges are set and make recommendations on how it could be improved.